Young schoolteacher protected a girl. Not knowing she was the governor's bride, Sam McKinnon buried his best friend with trembling hands on a Tuesday morning. But 3 days later, he'd swear on his mother's grave that Jake Morrison walked back into his life through the swinging doors of Murphy's Saloon. The hammer felt heavier than it should have in Sam McKinnon's weathered hands. Each strike against the makeshift cross drove splinters deeper into his calloused palms. But the pain was nothing compared to the hollow ache that had settled in his chest like stone. The wood was rough pine, hastily cut from fence posts because there hadn't been money for proper lumber. There never was. Jake Morrison lay 6 feet beneath the Colorado dirt, wrapped in Sam's only spare blanket because a coffin was another luxury they couldn't afford. 3 days had passed since the bullet found Jake's chest instead of Sam's. 3 days since his partner's blood had soaked into the dusty ground outside Silverton. 3 days since Jake's final words had branded themselves into Sam's memory like a cattle iron. "Take care of the ranch, Sam. Don't let them win." The wind picked up across the empty prairie, carrying the scent of coming snow and the distant lowing of cattle that would soon need to be sold to pay debts they'd never be able to clear. Sam's horse, a tired bay mare named Belle, stood tethered to the lone cottonwood tree, her ears flicking nervously as if she could sense the wrongness that had settled over their small spread like a shroud. Sam stepped back from a grave and wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his sleeve. The cross stood crooked in the hard earth, listing slightly to the left like everything else in his life. No preacher had come to say words over Jake. The nearest church was 2 days' ride, and Sam couldn't spare the time or the horse feed. Instead, he'd mumbled his own clumsy prayer, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. "You should have ducked faster," he whispered to the mound of earth. Always were too slow when it mattered. But Jake had been fast enough when it counted. Fast enough to throw himself between Sam and Crenshaw's gun. Fast enough to take the bullet meant for the man who owed money to half the territory. Fast enough to die for a friend who'd led him into trouble one too many times. The cattle rustling had been Sam's idea. Desperate times called for desperate measures, he'd told Jake, and the Morton spread had more head than any honest rancher could count. What was a dozen steers to a man like Morton, who owned half the valley and most of the politicians in it? But Crenshaw had been waiting in the canyon like he'd known they were coming, and the whole thing had gone sideways faster than a spooked horse. Sam pulled his hat down against the wind and turned toward the small cabin they'd built with their own hands 5 years ago. The roof leaked, the door hung crooked on its hinges, and the windows were patched with oiled paper instead of glass. But it had been home. Now it felt like a tomb. Inside, Jake's belongings sat exactly where he'd left them. His spare shirt hung on a peg by the door. His coffee cup sat unwashed by the cold stove. His book, the only one he owned, a water-stained copy of Shakespeare's plays, lay open on the table to the page he'd been reading the night before he died. Sam couldn't bring himself to close it. The bank notice lay beside the book, the words swimming before Sam's tired eyes. Foreclosure. 30 days. Payment in full. He crumpled the paper in his fist and threw at the wall, where it bounced off and rolled into a corner like a tumbleweed. Outside, Belle whinnied softly, and Sam went to the window. The mare was staring toward town, her ears pricked forward as if she'd heard something. Sam listened but heard only the wind and the creak of the old windmill. Still, something felt wrong. More wrong than usual. He checked his revolver out of habit, though he had only 3 bullets left and no money to buy more. The gun felt cold and heavy in his hand, a reminder of all the things he'd done wrong and all the things he'd failed to do right. Jake had always been the better shot, the steadier hand. Jake had been better at everything, really, except maybe at staying alive. As darkness settled over the prairie like a worn quilt, Sam lit a single candle and sat at the table across from Jake's empty chair. He poured himself a shot of whiskey from the bottle they'd been saving for a special occasion that would never come. The liquid burned his throat and warmed his belly, but it couldn't touch the cold that had settled in his bones. "I don't know how to do this without you," he said to the empty room. "I don't know how to save what we built." The candle flickered in the draft, casting dancing shadows on the walls. For a moment, Sam could almost imagine Jake sitting across from him, raising his own glass in a toast to better days and borrowed time. But when he blinked, there was only empty air and the weight of promises he couldn't keep. Tomorrow he would ride into Silverton. Tomorrow he would face the townspeople who whispered behind his back and the creditors who wanted their pound of flesh. Tomorrow he would try to figure out how a man rebuilds his life when half his heart lies buried in the cold ground. But tonight, Sam McKinnon sat with his ghosts and his whiskey, wondering if some wounds ever truly heal or if they just learn to bleed more quietly. When Sam McKinnon pushed through Murphy's saloon doors looking for answers, he found his dead partner, Jake, sitting at the bar. Nursing a whiskey and talking like death was just another day at the office. The saloon doors swung shut behind Sam with their familiar squeak, and the noise of Silverton's evening crowd washed over him like a tide. Tobacco smoke hung thick in the air, mixing with the smell of spilled beer and unwashed bodies. The piano player in the corner hammered out a tune that had seen better days, his fingers dancing across keys that hadn't been tuned since Lincoln was president. Sam needed information more than he needed whiskey, but his hands shook as he approached the bar. 3 days of grief and no sleep had left him hollow-eyed and unsteady. Murphy nodded at him from behind the polished wood, already reaching for the bottle of rot gut that Sam usually favored when he had coin to spare. "On the house tonight, Sam," Murphy said, his Irish accent thick as molasses. "Heard about Jake. Sorry for your loss." Sam nodded his thanks and wrapped his fingers around the glass, grateful for something solid to hold on to. The whiskey burned going down, but it was a good burn, one that reminded him he was still among the living. He was about to ask Murphy what he knew about Crenshaw when a laugh from the far end of the bar froze the blood in his veins. He knew that laugh. He'd heard it 1,000 times around campfires and card tables, during cattle drives and long winter nights when the wind howled outside their cabin. It was Jake Morrison's laugh, unmistakable as his own heartbeat. Sam turned slowly, afraid his grief-addled mind was playing tricks on him. But there, sitting at the far end of the bar with his back to the room, was a man in a familiar worn leather vest. The same vest Jake had been wearing when the bullet took him. The same vest Sam had wrapped around his friend's body before lowering him into the ground. The man lifted his glass in a toast to no one in particular, and Sam caught sight of his profile. The sharp nose, the stubbled jaw, the scar above the left eyebrow from a horse kick 3 summers past. It was Jake Morrison, as real as the whiskey in Sam's trembling hand. Sam's legs moved without his permission, carrying him across the crowded room. Other patrons stepped aside, sensing something in his bearing that warned them to give him space. The piano player hit a sour note and kept playing, oblivious to the miracle unfolding in his audience. "Jake!" The man turned, and Sam's world tilted sideways. It was Jake's face, but different somehow. The eyes were deeper, shadowed with something that hadn't been there before. The smile was the same crooked grin Sam remembered, but it carried weight now, like a man bearing secrets too heavy for one soul to hold. "Took you long enough to find me," Jake said, raising his glass. "Have a seat, partner. We need to talk." Sam collapsed onto the bar stool beside him, his mind struggling to process what his eyes were telling him. Jake was here, solid and real, the smell of leather and tobacco clinging to him like always. But underneath, Sam caught something else, the cold scent of turned earth and winter rain. "You're dead," Sam whispered. "I buried you myself. I drove the nails into your coffin cross." Jake's smile faded, and he stared down at his whiskey. "Death ain't what I thought it would be, Sam. Turns out some debts follow a man past the grave. This isn't real. I'm losing my mind. You always were the practical one." Jake reached out and gripped Sam's wrist. His fingers were cold as winter morning, but solid as iron. "Feel real enough to you?" Sam jerked his hand back, but the sensation lingered. Around them, the saloon continued its nightly ritual of drinking and gambling, but no one else seemed to notice the dead man at the bar. Murphy served drinks to other customers without so much as a glance in Jake's direction. "They can't see you," Sam realized. "Only you, partner. Only you." Jake finished his whiskey and set the glass down with a soft click. "And only for a while. Time's a luxury I don't have much of." Why? Why are you here? Jake's eyes met his, and Sam saw pain there deeper than any bullet wound. Because I failed you, Sam. Because I let you walk into that canyon blind, and now you're carrying the weight of my mistakes along with your own. Your mistakes? Jake, you died saving my life. Did I? Or did I die because I was too proud to tell you the truth? Jake's voice dropped to a whisper. Crenshaw knew we were coming, Sam. Someone told him. Someone who knew our plans, knew our route, knew exactly when and where to wait. The words hit Sam like a physical blow. What are you saying? I'm saying we were betrayed by someone we trusted. Someone who wanted both of us dead, but settled for half the job. Jake stood, his form seeming to shimmer slightly in the lamplight. And I'm saying you're still in danger, partner. More danger than you know. Sam reached out instinctively, but his hand passed through empty air. Jake was already moving toward the door, his boots making no sound on the saloon floor. He paused at the entrance and looked back, his eyes reflecting the light like a wolf's. Meet me at the old mine tomorrow at dawn, Sam. I'll tell you everything. But trust no one until then. No one. The doors swung shut, and Jake Morrison was gone, leaving only the lingering scent of grave dirt and the impossible memory of a dead man's touch. Sam sat frozen at the bar, staring at the empty glass Jake had left behind. When Murphy came to collect it, he frowned and picked up nothing but air. You all right there, Sam? You look like you've seen a ghost. Sam opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again. How could he explain what couldn't be explained? How could he tell Murphy that the dead walked among them, carrying secrets and warnings from beyond the grave? Instead, he dropped a coin on the bar and walked into the night, his mind reeling with questions that had no earthly answers. Behind him, the piano played on, filling the saloon with music that suddenly sounded like a funeral dirge. And somewhere in the darkness, Sam could swear he heard the distant sound of Jake's laughter, carried on the wind like a promise or a threat. Jake Morrison had returned from the dead with a warning. But as dawn broke over the abandoned mine, Sam discovered that some truths are more dangerous than bullets, and time was running out for both the living and the dead. The old Copper King mine squatted against the mountainside like a wound that refused to heal. Sam had ridden through the pre-dawn darkness, Bell's hooves finding the familiar path despite the shadows. The mine had been abandoned for 2 years now, ever since the vein played out and the company pulled up stakes, leaving behind only empty shafts and broken dreams. Jake was waiting for him at the entrance, his form more solid in the gray light of approaching dawn than it had been in the saloon. He sat on a fallen timber, whittling at a piece of pine with the bone-handled knife Sam had given him for his birthday 3 years past. The same knife that should have been buried with him in that blanket-wrapped grave. You came, Jake said without looking up. Wasn't sure you would. Sam dismounted and tied Bell to a rusted support beam. His hand rested on his gun, but, though he wasn't sure what good it would do against a dead man. I need answers, Jake. Real ones. Real. Jake looked up and smiled, but there was no warmth in it. That's a funny word coming from a man talking to a ghost. He stood and slipped the knife into his belt. But I suppose real is what we make it. The morning air was cold enough to show their breath, but only Sam's formed white clouds in the chill. Jake moved like a living man, but he cast no shadow on the mine-scarred ground. Tell me about the betrayal, Sam said. Jake walked to the mine entrance and peered into the darkness beyond. Sheriff Morton, he said simply, been working with the cattle rustlers for months. Uses his badge to cover their tracks, keeps the law looking the other way. Crenshaw's his hired gun. The words hit Sam like a physical blow. Morton had been the one to investigate Jake's death, the one who'd ruled it an accident during a botched robbery attempt. The same Morton who'd been pressuring Sam about his debts, offering to buy the ranch for half its worth. How do you know this? Dead men hear things, Sam. Whispers carry further when you ain't got breath to stop them. Jake turned back to him, and Sam saw that his friend's eyes were changing, becoming more translucent as the sun climbed higher. Morton's been stealing cattle and selling them through a network that runs all the way to Denver. Your ranch sits right in the middle of his operation. He needs that land, so he had us killed for it. Tried to, but I got in the way. Jake's form flickered like candlelight in a draft. And now he's got a problem. You're still alive, and you're asking questions. Sam felt the pieces clicking into place like bullets sliding into a cylinder. The foreclosure notice. He's using the bank to force me out. That's the legal way. If it doesn't work. Jake touched his chest where the bullet had found him. Well, accidents happen all the time out here. The implications crashed over Sam like an avalanche. Morton controlled the law, the bank, and the men with guns. He was trapped in a web that stretched from the state capitol to every crooked judge and bought politician in between. What am I supposed to do with this? Sam asked. Who's going to believe me? And even if they did, who's going to stand against Morton? Nobody, Jake said, which is why we're going to take him down ourselves. We? Jake, you're dead. I know. Jake's form was growing more transparent with each passing minute, like morning mist burning off in the sun. But I got enough time left for one last job. Enough time to set things right. He walked to where Sam stood and placed a cold hand on his shoulder. There's a shipment of stolen cattle moving through Devil's Canyon tomorrow night. Morton's men are driving them to the railhead in Durango. We stop that shipment, we get the proof we need. And then what? Take it to who? Morton owns the sheriff's office. Federal marshals coming through next week. Man named Garrett, out of Denver. He's clean, Sam. One of the few left. Jake's grip tightened, and Sam could feel his friend's desperation bleeding through the cold touch. But I won't be here to see it. This borrowed time comes with a price. What price? Jake's smile was sad as winter rain. Dawn tomorrow, I go back. No second chances, no extensions. Just gone. He looked down at his hands, which were now so transparent Sam could see the ground through them. One night to make it right, partner. One night to save your ranch and put Morton where he belongs. I can't do this alone, Jake. I'm not the gunfighter you were. You're stronger than you think, Sam McKinnon. Always have been. Jake's voice was growing fainter, like an echo in a deep canyon. And you won't be alone. Not really. Part of me will always be with you, watching your back, keeping you steady. The sun crested the mountain peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. Jake's form began to fade more rapidly, like a photograph left too long in bright light. The cattle will be moving through Devil's Canyon at midnight, he said, his voice now barely a whisper. Morton will be there personally to oversee the operation. It's your chance, Sam. Our chance. Jake, wait. But his friend was already dissolving into the morning light, leaving only the scent of pine and the memory of a cold touch. Sam stood alone at the mine entrance, surrounded by the detritus of broken dreams and abandoned hopes, carrying the weight of a dead man's final mission. Bell nickered softly, and Sam turned to see a rider approaching from the valley below. Even at distance, he could make out the glint of a sheriff's badge and the purposeful set of the horseman's shoulders. Morton had come calling, right on schedule. Sam checked his revolver and counted his remaining bullets. 3 shots for whatever was coming. 3 shots to buy himself the time he needed to prepare for tomorrow night's reckoning. As Morton drew closer, Sam could swear he heard Jake's voice on the wind, faint but certain. Trust yourself, partner. Trust yourself, and finish what we started. The dead had delivered their message. Now it was up to the living to see justice done, one bullet at a time, if necessary. At Devil's Canyon, Sam McKinnon faced Sheriff Morton alone in the pre-dawn darkness, armed with 3 bullets, a dead friend's courage, and the truth that would either set him free or send him to join Jake in the ground. The canyon walls rose like cathedral spires against the star-drunk sky, their limestone faces scarred by wind and time. Sam crouched behind a boulder 20 yards from the narrow pass, his breath forming white clouds in the cold mountain air. Midnight had come and gone, and still no sign of Morton's cattle drive. His 3 remaining bullets felt heavy as stones in the cylinder of his Colt. Bell waited in the trees beyond the canyon mouth, reins tied loose in case Sam needed to make a fast escape. If things went wrong, and they probably would, at least the mare would find her way home to graze in freedom while the bank men argued over a dead man's debts. The sound of lowing cattle drifted on the wind, followed by the creak of leather and the soft jingle of spurs. Sam pressed himself deeper into the shadows as the first of the stolen steers emerged from the pass, driven by 3 riders whose faces were hidden beneath wide hat brims. Behind them came more cattle, at least 50 head bearing brands from a dozen different ranches. Sheriff Morton rode at the rear of the procession, his badge catching starlight like a fallen star. Even in the darkness, Sam could see the man's satisfied smile. This was just another night's work for him, another step toward owning everything worth having in the territory. Sam waited until the entire group had passed his hiding spot, then began following at a distance. The plan Jake had whispered from beyond the grave was simple. Wait for the handoff at the rail yard, gather evidence, and hope Federal Marshal Garrett would arrive in time to matter. But plans had a way of crumbling like old parchment when bullets started flying. The procession made good time down the canyon trail, and within an hour Sam could see the lights of the rail yard gleaming in the distance. A train sat waiting on the siding, its engine breathing steam like a sleeping dragon. Men moved among the cattle cars, preparing for the loading that would send the stolen stock east to market. Sam guided Belle to a ridge overlooking the rail yard and tied her in a stand of aspen. From here he could see everything. Morton directing his men, Crenshaw checking the cars, and a well-dressed stranger who had to be the Denver buyer. All the pieces of the conspiracy laid out under the weak light of oil lamps. He pulled out the small notebook Jake had always carried and began writing down what he saw. Brand markings, names, the number of cattle cars. Evidence that would hang Morton and his men if it ever reached honest hands. The pencil stub felt clumsy in his cold fingers, but he forced himself to be thorough. Jake would have been proud of his attention to detail. A hand fell on his shoulder. Sam spun around to find Crenshaw standing behind him, the gunman's Colt already drawn and leveled at his chest. In the darkness, Sam hadn't heard him approach. "Sheriff Morton thought you might show up here," Crenshaw said, his voice soft as silk over steel. "Said you've been asking too many questions since your partner died." "Jake Morrison was murdered," Sam said, his own gun still holstered but his hand inching toward it. "Jake Morrison was stupid. Just like you." Crenshaw's finger tightened on the trigger. "Should have taken a sheriff's offer for your land and ridden away. Now you get to join your friend in the ground." The shot rang out across the rail yard, echoing off the canyon walls like thunder. But it wasn't Crenshaw who fired. The gunman staggered backward, clutching his shoulder as blood seeped between his fingers. Behind him, Federal Marshal Garrett emerged from the shadows, his smoking revolver trained on Crenshaw's chest. "Federal law enforcement," Garrett announced. "You're all under arrest for cattle theft and conspiracy." The rail yard erupted into chaos. Morton's men scattered like startled quail, some running for their horses while others dove for cover behind the cattle cars. Morton himself drew his gun and put a shot toward Garrett that sparked off the rocks near Sam's head. Sam finally cleared leather and put his first bullet into the oil lamp nearest Morton, plunging that section of the yard into darkness. His second shot took down one of the rustlers who was trying to flank Garrett's position. His third and final bullet he saved, knowing he might need it from Morton himself. The gunfight lasted less than 5 minutes, but it felt like hours. When the smoke cleared and the echoes faded, Morton lay dead beside the train, Garrett's bullet having found its mark. Crenshaw sat propped against a fence post, wounded but alive, and singing like a canary about Morton's entire operation. As dawn broke over the Colorado territory, Sam found himself standing beside Jake's grave once more. But this time, he wasn't alone. Marshal Garrett had ridden out with him to hear the full story, and the notebook full of evidence sat safe in the lawman saddlebags. "Your friend saved a lot of lives," Garrett said, adjusting his hat against the morning sun. "Morton's operation stretched all the way to Kansas. Would have kept growing if Jake hadn't put himself between you and that bullet." Sam knelt beside the crooked wooden cross and placed his hand on the mound of earth. The ground felt warm beneath his palm, as if something stirred beneath the surface. "He came back," Sam said quietly. "Somehow, he came back to help me finish this." Garrett was a practical man who dealt in evidence and testimony, but he'd seen enough in his years as a lawman to know that some things couldn't be explained by logic alone. He simply nodded and turned away, giving Sam a moment alone with his ghosts. The wind picked up across the prairie, carrying the scent of new grass and distant rain. Sam thought he heard something in that wind, a familiar laugh, perhaps, or the sound of spurs on hardpack. He looked around, but saw only empty land stretching to the horizon. "Thank you," he whispered to the grave, "for everything." When he finally stood and walked back to where Belle waited, Sam felt lighter than he had in months. The bank foreclosure would be withdrawn now that Morton's conspiracy had been exposed. The ranch would survive, and with it the dream he and Jake had built together. Behind him, the wooden cross cast its shadow across the earth, marking the resting place of a man who had loved his friend enough to die for him twice. And in the distance, barely visible against the morning sky, Sam could swear he saw a familiar figure riding toward the sunrise, finally free to rest in whatever peace awaited good men on the other side of the grave. The debt between the living and the dead was paid in full.